Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Scotus and Ockham and divine law. Let us begin. So Scotus first is historically first and sets up some of the early thinking that will give rise to the Reformation, that will give rise to a lot of the main ideas that shape contemporary society. So Scotus is one of those pivotal figures that is important to understand to get a sense of the main narrative of Western civilization. And we're going to talk about his conception of divine law. There, he departs from some of the main ideas that begin in the Aristotelian tradition that are enshrined in the Aquinas' uh, version or incorporation of Christianity with the Aristotelian tradition. And then Scotus is going to be departing from some of the basic ideas. Um, so, agreeing with Aquinas and agreeing with Aristotle, Scotus notices or insists that there is this kind of natural inclination of natural tendency that humans have towards happiness. At the heart of Aristotelian ethics and Aquinas' ethics, grounded in Aristotle, is the idea that we naturally seek happiness. We naturally desire to be happy. And then freedom is understood in terms of that. We don't choose to be happy. We just naturally want to be happy. It's kind of naturally necessary for us to pursue the goal of our happiness. Freedom is the ability or faculty that we have to devise, understand, and choose the means whereby we become happy. In all of the conception of freedom is kind of embedded in that psychological story about human beings and motivations. It is not until Scotus, at least in part in this tradition, that we see a clear departure. And Scotus thinks that we do, of course, have the natural tendency toward happiness, but that we have a separate natural tendency towards justice. And justice is where morality lies. And those are different natural tendencies. Sometimes they align, but sometimes they come apart. So here's a cool quote. Natural appetite for justice is a tendency to obey the moral law, no matter what the consequences may be for the well being or welfare of the agent. And now this is a radical departure from the history, the Aristotelian tradition up until now. According to Aristotle and Aquinas following him, the desire for justice is a desire for a particular kind of virtue, the fulfillment of which, the satisfaction of which, the growth of which becomes an instrument of, in part of one's happiness. So one wants to be just, says Aristotle, because justice is one of the basic virtues of humanity. And to the extent that one is just, one flourishes and grows as an individual, and thereby one attains happiness. So there is no tension between the demands of justice and the demands of happiness, precisely because one becomes happy precisely by being just in having the other virtues. Scotus disagrees. Scotus thinks that to be truly committed to justice is to do so for its own sake and not for the sake of, say, your happiness. It kind of cheapens your commitment to morality and justice if you do it ultimately for your own happiness, Scotus argues. So morality and happiness come apart, or at least can come apart. Uh, in the way that Scotus is thinking about it, morality is not no longer the Aristotelian model of human flourishing and growing into virtues, but rather morality is the act of complying with the moral law. And the moral law is the kind of rules or commands imposed by those that have the relevant authority. In that kind of willingness to comply that moral law part, the willingness to comply with justice, is regardless of one's interest or inclinations or even happiness. That's what makes it pure. That's what makes it good. That's what makes it just. You're only truly good when you seek to do that which is right because it is right, independently of whether or not it makes you happy, claims Scotus. Um, and now we get it because of this distinction between two different kinds of ends that are natural for humanity, happiness and morality or justice. We have a different conception of freedom. Freedom is no longer the choosing between means to be happy, but rather is a way of try to balance the different conflicting demands of morality and happiness when these conflict. Again, they don't have to conflict. And Kenny thinks that Scotus got it right. So Kenny writes, Scotus is surely right. He's correct. And he gives us several examples. And one of the examples he puts forth is the daughter, loving daughter, who gives up her dreams of a career or some other such dreams that she thinks will make her happy for the sake of taking care of her elder parents. So that's why I give you this picture here of a daughter kissing her older mom. Um, Here's the Scotus view that Kenny thinks is correct. Part of why the daughter, is praiseworthy for this activity, part of what makes it legitimate love, is that she's engaged in an act of self-sacrifice. In other words, she's sacrificing her well-being, her happiness, the pursuit of her career or whatever the dreams or hopes that she thinks will satisfy her or will make her happy. She's given that up for the sake of the happiness of her mother. And that fact that she's sacrificing her happiness for the happiness of someone else is what makes her act legitimate love, legitimate self-sacrifice, and legitimate command. I'm sorry, legitimate case of getting for justice and and doing the right thing. If the daughter would be doing what she's doing, taking care of her mother, ultimately because it makes her happy, Scotus would argue that that's cheapening, that is undermining the legitimacy of her self-sacrifices, undermining the legitimacy of her commitment towards morality, for morality. And that is really a challenge that goes to the heart of the Aristotelian model. And people like Kinney think uh, Scotus is right. Like that's the right way of carving the terrain between morality and happiness. In Some of the differences come to the fore between two different models when we think about wrongdoing. So again, the eudaimonistic tradition is a tradition of thinking of happiness as flourishing, as growing, as developing the pure, distinctive human capacities, the Aristotelian tradition. That's the eudaimonia. That's the goal of flourishing of the individual. So according to that tradition, freedom is conceived as the ability to choose between two different possible means, or multiple different means for happiness. And importantly, because that's the model, wrongdoing, sinful behavior, doing the wrong thing, is represented. In fact, it has to be represented as something like the outcome of failure of the intellect of the person to understand what is it that makes them truly happy. All wrongful behavior, this model has it, this eudaimonistic model has to be the result of an intellectual mistake on the part of the person who is doing the wrong act. They think that that's what's going to make them happy, but it doesn't. And an example would be, for example, a cheating student, a student who cheats on the exam. They think that, hey, I can get the good grade without putting in the work. I'll be happier doing that. In the eudaimonistic tradition, uh, the explanation for the wrongful behavior is that the student is mistaken about what is good for them. Learning is better for them than merely, quickly getting the good grade and getting away with cheating. For Scotus, on the other hand, freedom extends. Freedom is broader. It's not just about choosing between means for this predetermined end of happiness, but choosing between independent and competing ultimate goals themselves, the goal of happiness and the goal of justice. And Scotus thinks they do conflict sometimes. And part of the role of freedom is choosing between to be happy or to be a good person, to be just. And sometimes those are in conflict. And freedom extends to that. So it has a much more existential weight, the freedom that Scotus assigns to humans. And when it comes to blame, blame now is not the result of mistakenly misunderstanding what's ultimately good for you, but rather choosing what is good for you instead of what you ought to do. So, because of the conflict between your happiness and justice, many times people that are selfish choose to be happy instead of doing the right thing. And that is why they're blameworthy. They didn't make a mistake about what was good for them. They knew what was good for them, namely the selfish thing. And it was selfish precisely because it clashed with morality, and they did what was good for them instead of what morality demanded. So it is the waywardness of the will. It is the capricious nature of the will. It's not the reason misjudging the situation that is at fault. It is the will choosing the wrong thing, namely the happiness instead of morality. That's why people are blameworthy, claims Scotus. Um, Importantly, the humanistic tradition has it that we know what is right by reasoning adequately, by reasoning properly, and then when all goes well, our ability to choose, follows the rightful exercise of our reason. And Aquinas, for example, will go as far as saying that when we judge mistakenly, when we make a mistake, because to be good, a good person is to reason properly and act on the basis of reason, and we don't know that we made a mistake. we should always follow a reason. We should always follow our conscience, which is just a different way of talking about reason operating in the matters of morality. So we should always do what reason commands, our reason commands, says Aquinas. Well, I guess that's the only guide we have for morality. For Scotus, what's right and what's wrong, it's not grounded in our reason, our ability to tell what's right versus what's wrong, our ignorance, our passions, the inner struggle of the mind, the inner dynamics of bringing about action. All of those are just irrelevant for rightfulness or wrongfulness. It is the external compliance or lack of compliance with the law as given by God that settles whether the action is sinful or not. It's not that not, it is nothing internal about the agent, to say a false belief, that is relevant for assessing whether it's right or wrong. It is whether or not the behavior complies or fails to comply with the divine law. So the divine law is going to play a big role in Scotus's conception of morality, and then it's going to get up and running. A lot of Christians are going to follow Scotus. So what is the natural law? So the natural law, historically going at least back to Augustine, is the collection or set of eternal truths about morality, like courage as a virtue. And typically, those eternal truths are understood as beyond the control of God. They're just eternal truths about the nature of morality. And God cannot change them. That's one of the elements of the natural law. And the other one is that human reason is capable of grasping it. That's why it's natural. It's not just imposed by an agent, and it's not just the will of some agent, even God. It is the nature of justice. It is the nature of courage. It is the nature of compassion. The reason can grasp and understand and then apply in particular cases. That is the historical conception of natural law as a way of understanding morality. Scotus is not quite going to reject natural law as such, but it's going to significantly diminish its scope. So Augustine and Aquinas, the two main hitters in Christian theology, think that, for example, think that the Ten Commandments are part of the natural law. Why did God give those commandments to Moses for people to follow? Well, precisely because they're part of the eternal truths that are the nature of morality. Scotus, however, thinks that a huge part of those commandments, namely I think 7 of them, the ones having to do with humans, are not part of the natural law. The commandments having to do with God, love God, make no images, and things like that, they are part of natural law because God's eternal essence, infinite essence, grounds the eternal laws. But nothing about human nature grounds anything in the eternal law. It is God's sheer will that decides that humans should not kill other humans, for example, or that we should keep our promises or not say lies. Those things are the result of God's will, God's commandments, God's freedom. God chose those things, but he could have chosen otherwise. So when God commands the Jewish people to kill its neighboring, tribal rivals, God is not doing anything wrong because God has final authority over life or death, and God gets to decide whether killing is right or wrong, killing humans is right or wrong. And sometimes he decides it is, sometimes he decides otherwise, and God is always right. Why? Because there are no moral, eternal truths, part of the natural law that constrain God's behavior. God has proper authority, and he exercises it sometimes one way, sometimes other ways, and it's up to God. Um, so Scotus goes so far as to insist that God has no obligations towards creatures. Given the morality that it's grounded in God's will, most of morality anyway, morality having to do with humans is grounded in God's will. God can will to be cruel towards humans. God can will to ignore humans. God can will to let people die with no reason. And God wouldn't be doing anything wrong. Because to do something wrong for God is to transgress the natural law. And the natural law does not apply to humans. It's only about God's nature. Um, so God has no obligations towards creatures. If God decides to kill a lot of humans just for the sake of killing them, he wouldn't be transgressing anything because God has authority over humans. Um, so this has crucial implications for thinking about morality. Morality is not something that reason can discover and understand. It's not that you can sit and deliberate with someone else about what's the right course of action. You cannot, because morality is grounded in God's will. The way of knowing what is right and what is wrong is by looking at divine revelation, how God conveyed his will. It's like if you're in an absolute monarch society, the way of knowing what's legal is not by thinking about, oh, well, what would be fair? No, it's just by looking at whatever it is that the dictates of the ruler have instituted. If the ruler decided, that half of the property will go to some people and half to the other, that's the will's, that's up to the ruler's will, and that is the law. And that's kind of the model that that Scotus has for morality. We don't think about what's moral. We look at the revelation, where God reveals His will, so that we can know what God commands for us, and then we just do it. We don't think about it. We cannot understand it by definition. Just the will of the free agent that is God. So sin, virtue, wrongdoing, and so on, those categories that are intrinsic properties of agents that in the older tradition are a kind of part of what defines who you are no longer understood in those terms. They're understood as something external. They are the result of complying or failing to comply with the commands laid upon God. And those commands are just the exercise of His freedom, not grounded in reasons, grounded in natural law. That's just what God decided to do. And these ideas were pretty radical at the time, but they gained momentum. And as Ockham picked them up, and then they were resurrected in the Reformation, especially John Calvin. So a lot of Protestant denominations have like these deep assumptions up until now. So let's look at Ockham briefly. Ockham is going to pick up some of these ideas by Scotus. It's going to emphasize them even more, stress them even more. So Ockham agrees with Scotus that freedom is the fundamental feature of human beings. What defines human beings is their freedom. And then he's going to define freedom in a particular way. And crucially, he's going to say that the will is independent from reason. For Aquinas, for Aristotle, one is free when one is acting on the basis of reason working properly. Ignorance undermines one's freedom. The passions undermine one's freedom. It is when things work properly, when the reason works properly, and then one acts on the basis of, chooses on the basis of reason, that things go well and that you're free. Ockham is not going to like the model. He's going to think that one can choose independently of what reason says. Ignorance may be an obstacle, but knowledge need not augment or increase freedom. We can choose to act on the basis of knowledge. We can even choose whether or not we want to be happy. Freedom extends to everything we get to do. And here's a quote to that effect. Every man experiences that however much reason may dictate one thing, he can will either to do it or not to do it, fail to will it, or will its opposite. Once reason has done its deliberation, is investigated into reality and realizes, hey, it would be best for me to, say, study for the exam. You still have the freedom to say, I don't care, and do something else. Not because the passions overpower you, not because you have made a mistake about what's good for you. You just have the freedom to choose to ignore what is good for you, to choose to ignore the knowledge that you have, and to choose to do what you want, regardless of the knowledge that you have and how well functioning your reason may be. Freedom extends to that extent, claims Ockham. And he ascribes the kind of freedom to God as well, and that's going to have important consequences for the nature of morality. So all divine law is subject to freedom of God. So Ockham is going to take the thing that Scotus said about the diminishing of the scope of natural law to completely eliminating. All morality is just a result of God's free choice, and God could have chosen otherwise. It's whatever God wants. And here's a quote from Ockham. God, in his absolute power, could command adultery and theft. And if he did so, such acts would not only cease to be sinful, but become obligatory. The reason why adultery is wrong is not because there's something about the act itself that is problematic. It's not something about human reason grasping that there's something problematic with the act. The reason that adultery is wrong is simply because God said, don't do it. God could have said, hey, have as much adulterous activity as you want. And if God were to have said that instead of simple behavior, it would have become obligatory behavior. He who's not engaging in adulterous behavior would be doing the wrong thing, claims Ockham. Divine law is completely up to God's unconstrained free will. Um, Humans have obligations towards God, namely towards anything and everything that God commands, because God has power over humans. God created them, He kind of owns them in some robust sense of owns them. So God can do with creatures as He will, and whatever God decides to command, it can never be wrong because God has power, and it's like the absolute ruler. If God commands something, then that just becomes the law of the land, and that becomes the right thing. So God cannot do anything to be unjust towards humans. And God has no obligations towards humans precisely because humans have no power over God. So it is God's having power over humans that grounds our obedience or compliance with God's commands. In the fact that we have no power over God means that He has no there are no obligation He has towards us because we have the power to impose a will upon God. Um, so morality becomes the mere result of the exercise of power of those that have it over those that don't. And it turns out God has all the power. So it's the exercise of God's power over humans, us that lack it, that becomes the ground for morality for Ockham. And again, this idea is going to be taken up by Calvin and other Protestant thinkers in the Reformation. Okay, let's stop here. See ya.